The recent weather in Texas has left many of us wondering if our vineyards were damaged by the extreme cold. Temperatures were below freezing across the entire state, and many areas fell to below zero in this historic weather event. In this video, we'll discuss how to assess winter injury to vineyards. First, we'll begin with a little background information on cold hardiness. The first sign that grapes are preparing for winter dormancy begins as early as midsummer with the formation of periderm. Shoots start changing from green to brown in color, beginning at the base of shoots, extending towards the tips. This is the first visible evidence that shoots are hardening off, and any green tissue that's left at the first hard freeze won't survive. Severe stress from drought, disease, significant herbicide injury, and other stresses may delay or reduce this process. Also, during this period of time, carbohydrates produced by the leaves are stored in the permanent structures of the vines, including the dormant buds. This is both necessary to support new growth in the following spring and to provide protection against cold temperatures, as these carbohydrates act as a natural antifreeze, keeping cells from freezing even when temperatures fall below 32. As temperatures cool off in the fall and early winter, and as the days get shorter, grapes continue to acclimate or prepare for dormancy. Acclimation of the cells also includes a slow dehydration and a concentration of cryoprotectants, including carbohydrates and certain types of proteins. Free water is removed from cells, or it becomes bound to these cryoprotectants to prevent ice formation within the cell, which would cause damage. As winter progresses, vines continue to become increasingly hardy with exposure to cold temperatures. Maximum cold hardiness generally occurs in midwinter. However, when temperatures warm up, deacclimation can occur. Deacclimation is essentially the opposite of acclimation, and grapes become less cold hardy. Unfortunately, deacclimation occurs more rapidly than acclimation, and here in Texas, warm weather during the winter is quite common. Therefore, the maximum cold hardiness reported for many grape varieties is less likely to occur here. In fact, the relative cold hardiness of a grape variety is not just related to its ability to acclimate to withstand cold temperatures, it's also related to its rate of deacclimation. A variety could have great maximum cold hardiness, but if it's not fully acclimated, or if it deacclimates, it could sustain damage at much higher temperatures. When we talk about cold hardiness and winter injury, we're generally talking about two aspects: injury to the dormant buds and to the wood of the vine. When fully acclimated, dormant buds are generally less cold hardy than canes, cordons, and trunks, but in 2018, some vineyards observed more injury to the vascular tissue of the wood rather than or in addition to the buds themselves after a hard freeze in December that followed a very long stretch of warm weather. As buds acclimate for winter, they become somewhat isolated from the vascular tissue of the canes, and this reduces their potential to rehydrate, or at least slows the process. This may explain why some vines received injury to cordons and trunks, but the buds were still alive. The buds themselves may have been more acclimated at that point in time. This is more commonly observed in muscadine grapes, where dormant buds may be more cold hardy than the permanent structures of the vines. Due to the timing and the breadth of the cold temperatures we experienced this year, we're likely to see a range of damage to vineyards in Texas. Some vineyards in the southern Gulf Coast were already past bud break, and the freezing temperatures resulted in shoot loss. Other vineyards in the region had been experiencing sap flow for some time, so temperatures in the single digits and the teens may have been quite damaging to the wood and the buds of the vines. Buds become increasingly susceptible to injury as they advance in development, and injury to the vascular or conductive tissue is more likely to occur at sap flow or near bud break. Elsewhere in the state, temperatures drop down to single digits to even below zero for quite some time, and some of those vineyards may have experienced damage as well, but that's expected to vary by site. As previously mentioned, the type and severity of damage that may have occurred is likely to vary by specific location, variety, and other factors that affect cold hardiness, such as the physiological state of the vines. Fully dormant vines are more cold hardy than those that have already begun to deacclimate. It should also be noted that ice formation on vines generally does not provide meaningful insulation. When liquid water freezes, it is an exothermic or heat-producing reaction. However, as soon as the liquid becomes a solid, temperatures begin to cool off to ambient air temperature. If the humidity is sufficiently low, sublimation occurs where the ice turns into a vapor or gas. This reaction is endothermic or heat-absorbing and can actually cool the ice to below the air temperature. So in other words, this should not be confused with sprinkler frost protection, which relies on the continuous application of water using overhead sprinklers. If enough water is continuously applied throughout a cold event until all of the ice is naturally melted, it can actually keep plant tissues significantly warmer than ambient air temperatures, providing protection. Unfortunately, overhead sprinklers require a significant investment in infrastructure and a very high volume of water. Therefore, this method of frost protection is generally not feasible for most vineyards in Texas. So how do you know if your vineyard was damaged? Determining damage to dormant buds is fairly simple and straightforward. You can go out and collect canes from each variety, block, or specific area of the vineyard where you suspect damage may have occurred. Keep the canes at room temperature or warmer for at least a day in order for damaged buds to be distinguishable from healthy buds. With a razor blade, carefully slice the top off of the bud and continue to cut thin slices until the primary bud becomes visible as seen here. A living bud will appear as bright green, where a recently killed bud will have a darker water-soaked appearance. Over time, dead buds will darken and turn brown as the tissue oxidizes. If significant primary bud damage is observed, you can evaluate the viability of secondary buds by cutting slightly deeper. As you continue to cut, the tertiary bud may also become visible. However, if you cut too deep, you'll cut below the bud into what's called the bud cushion, and you won't be able to get an accurate assessment as it often appears green, even if the primary bud is dead. After you cut around 100 buds sampled from 20 to 30 different vines across the block, you can determine the proportion of primary buds that have been killed. It's best to sample buds towards the base of canes that is consistent in size with the spurs that will be retained at pruning. If primary bud damage is observed, you may be able to leave more buds at final pruning to account for the loss in yield potential. For example, if 25% primary bud loss occurred, you may be able to make up for the loss in yield by leaving 25% more count buds at final pruning. However, if you use this strategy, shoot thinning will likely be required to remove unfruitful shoots that emerge in order to prevent canopy overcrowding. Additionally, leaving excessively long spurs to make up for a high degree of bud loss will likely complicate pruning and positioning of spurs in the following season. When it is possible, delaying final pruning until bud break or shortly after can help simplify pruning decisions. It's important to sample buds for all varieties and blocks to determine the extent of damage that may have occurred. You may find that damage varies by location across a vineyard block or site, so it can be worthwhile to sample locations such as low spots that are prone to cooler temperatures and any problem areas separately. While you're sampling buds, you can also look for damage to the canes using a knife test. With a sharp knife or razor blade, cut a thin slice just under the bark to evaluate the vascular tissue. Immediately underneath the bark is the phloem. This layer of vascular tissue is responsible for transporting carbohydrates produced by the leaves around the plant. The thin layer of tissue immediately past the phloem is called the vascular cambium. This layer produces new conductive tissue each season. Beyond the cambium is the xylem, which is the tissue that's responsible for water transport. The phloem and the vascular cambium are generally more prone to freeze damage as compared to the xylem. Damage will initially appear as darkened and water-soaked, turning brown to gray with time. These Blanc de Bois canes were sampled approximately 1 week after the cold event of February 2021. Damage to the phloem and vascular cambium is already visible, and with time it will become increasingly apparent. A knife test may also be used on cordons and trunks to look for damage to the conductive tissue. However, unless damage is very widespread, it will be impossible to determine the full extent of injury that occurred to the woody parts of the vine until after bud break. It's also generally not a great idea to make a bunch of unnecessary wounds to trunks and cordons, as they can serve as sites for infection by trunk disease pathogens and crown gall. So in other words, it's going to be necessary to wait until at least bud break or longer to determine the full extent of the damage that may have occurred to the woody parts of the vine. As you walk your vineyard, a more obvious sign of serious winter injury may be splits along trunks and along cordons. Vines that have sustained severe trunk, cordon, or cane damage may be slower to break bud, or they may have a sporadic bud break. A telltale sign of trunk damage is heavy suckering from the base of the vine. Vines that are damaged will try to repair themselves, and they can often overcome minor injury. But if the damage to the vascular tissue is significant, vines may begin to grow in the spring and then collapse during the growing season, especially in midsummer when water demands are the highest. Additionally, vines that have damaged trunks and cordons are going to be more prone to crown gall and invasion by trunk disease. So what do you do if you see damage to trunks and cordons? Unfortunately, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach here. If serious damage does occur, vines may be heavily pruned to start reestablishing trunks and cordons this season. However, it is recommended to leave several shoots rather than thinning down to 1 or 2 shoots for trunk and cordon replacement. Doing so can result in high vigor and bull canes that will be less cold hardy and not well suited to serve as trunks or cordons. On grafted vines, it's important that workers recognize the difference between rootstock suckers and the fruiting variety to prevent the retention of rootstock shoots as trunks. It may be difficult to determine the best course of action moving forward, as every vineyard is different, and decisions may be influenced by factors such as labor availability, vine age, and the unique characteristics of your vineyard. Here at the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, we're happy to help where we can, and please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions.